Hello, my name is Barbara Webbles, and I would like to welcome you to the first Professional Patient Advocates in the Life Sciences webinar. PPALS was established by Jane Gershkowitz, Jean Campbell, and myself in 2014 with the goal of providing an educational curriculum to persons working in patient advocacy roles in pharma and also for the leaders of patient advocacy organizations. In conjunction with our partnership with Sanford Research Institute in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, we have held a 3-day patient advocacy certification training each May from 2013 to 2019. In order for attendees to receive a certificate of completion, they must complete a capstone project on a topic of interest to them that adds to the body of knowledge of patient advocacy. The impact of COVID has challenged us to find a new direction to continue to provide meaningful educational programs for professional patient advocates with the hallmark of our in-person course of studies. Following in that tradition, we are offering a series of webinars on timely topics throughout the year. Today, Mike Bodulow, the manager of Global Patient Advocacy and Engagement at BioMarin, will be leading us off with his presentation on the integration of the patient voice in metrics to predict clinical trial success. Mike attended PPALS in 2018, and his presentation today fulfills his capstone project requirement. Mike will be discussing the patient advocacy engagement metrics, which quantify how effectively BioMarin has incorporated the patient voice into their clinical development programs. Mike joined BioMarin in April of 2014 with a passion for improving the lives of patients and families living with rare diseases. Mike started in the global project management team and has leveraged his organizational knowledge to establish metrics, develop portfolio-wide processes, and generate timelines to track progress within the global patient advocacy and engagement strategic plans. His overarching goal is to ensure that patient advocacy becomes embedded within the standard operating procedures, processes, forms, and timelines at BioMarin to ensure that the patient voice is leveraged early, often, and consistently across all programs. He also manages the Patient Advocacy Leadership Councils, the therapeutic-area patient advocacy and partnership teams, as well as the patient engagement team. Mike completed his undergraduate studies in communication at San Jose University and is a certified associate in project management with the Project Management Institute. Mike is based in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he became a member of the original Tulsa remote cohort. He'll tell you what that means at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to type in questions during the presentation. We will answer as many of them as we can at the end. Also, for people who were unable to attend real time today, we will be sending out a link with a link to the webinar within the next few days. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that excellent introduction, Barb. I'm really excited to be here today, and you helped me in not having to give myself a big introduction. So without further ado, this is a presentation about the patient voice and metrics and something. So before I even started in patient advocacy, my soon-to-be boss, Ali Mohammadi, the head of the department, came to me and he said, look, Mike, we need to get a metrics program off the ground. We need to be able to showcase the value of patient engagement at BioMarin to really say, here's the value to the business. We can't have people continue to think that patient advocacy is this feel-good, nice-to-have activity. We need a metrics program that showcases value. And before I even got hired, I said, sure, of course I can do that. I know metrics. I'm a project manager. This should be easy, right? I'll search the literature, find out what other companies are doing, modify them based on what our team needs, and roll out a program. Well, it turned out that that wasn't so easy because there is not a lot of published literature on metrics for patient engagement. So what I thought was going to be an easy couple of weeks turns out that 3 years later now, there's still not a lot of published literature on metrics and patient engagement. So my goal today is to showcase the value of patient engagement, because here's our problem. I don't know how many times I've been asked these kinds of questions, but the goal is to be able to answer these questions. People ask us, what's the return on engagement or the return on investment of patient advocacy? What are the impacts of your team's patient advocacy activities? Why should we wait to finalize our protocol until receiving patient input? And you could insert anything in here, right? Why should we wait to finalize our target product profile? Why should we wait to finalize our product formulation? Why should we wait to decide if we're going to acquire this product? We should get patient input beforehand. How should we be incorporating the patient voice into our development programs? When should we be engaging with the patient community? And what types of questions should we be asking them? So my goal today is to help us solve this problem. And the solution to this problem is showcasing the business value of patient engagement. So there's an excellent article that Bennett Levitan was the first author on, and it's called Assessing the Financial Value of Patient Engagement. And in this article, they talk about the 5 key business drivers: revenue, cost, time, risks, and this idea of intangibles. Intangibles, a great example of intangibles in patient engagement is patient satisfaction. How do we measure the satisfaction of patients? How do we showcase the value of this? And so for this reason, I've decided not to focus on intangibles, and I've removed the intangibles from our metrics. Because when we're speaking to executives at a pharmaceutical company, we really want to say, what's the impact to the bottom line, right? How's this going to impact our time to launch, reduce our risks of a failed program, reduce the costs, or increase our revenue? We need to start translating patient advocacy from this is what patients want, this is a nice to have, to here's how this impacts your bottom line. And as I talk about value, remember, I'm talking about value as perceived by the pharmaceutical industry, not value as perceived by the patient communities we serve or by the patient advocacy groups we partner with. So we had an original metrics program when I joined the team, which was really just trying to track everything. There was 14 metrics, 22 leading indicators. It was a 20-page slide deck that tried to track everything. And by removing these intangible aspects of how satisfied are the patients, things like that, we were able to reduce our metrics to something more manageable: 6 metrics, 11 indicators, and 8 slides. So I'm sure at this point, those of you who've attended a lot of metrics discussions in patient engagement are thinking, that's great, Mike. Can we please see the metrics and leading indicators? And my answer is yes, I will definitely be showing those to you today. That's the goal, is to run through slide by slide what we're doing at BioMarin. But before I jump into that, I want to orient you to the layout of this metrics program. And I want to kind of do a little bit of level setting so that everyone's on the same page with what is a metric, what is a leading indicator, and what we'll be looking at for all the subsequent slides. So the data here is not very useful except in explaining to you. So when we talk about metrics, we're talking about measurements. So here specifically measuring patient engagement. And so at the top of every metric slide, we'll showcase the overarching goal we hope to measure if we've done something successful. Next, let's define leading indicators. Leading indicators are, as the name implies, these indicators will lead to results or success. And so we're trying to quantify here the activities that will lead to success in meeting our metric. There's 1 to 3 leading indicators, maybe 4 on each slide. And so for each leading indicator, we'll have different criterias, which will correlate to different scores. And this will make more sense when I go through each slide and give you the examples. But I just want to orient you to the layout. Next, we have a status. So is that status complete with a check mark, on track, at risk, missed or delayed, or potentially removed or deferred? Then we talk about what stage of the research and development continuum this is completed at. There's 5 stages. So research, design, conduct, pre-approval and approval is what we call it at BioMarin, though I've seen in other aspects of literature, it also to be called analysis and reporting phases. So think about Research is before you even design a clinical study. Design is designing the clinical study. Conduct would be executing on that study. Analysis would be looking at the results, and reporting would be writing the final reports. Then you receive a score based on your leading indicator criteria that you've met, and then a comment section, which explains how we got to where we got. So in this example, we've achieved criteria 2 because we completed these activities, but not those. Or in the second leading indicator, we achieved criteria 3 because we missed A and B, but we hit criteria C, so we scored 1 out of 3. At the bottom of each metric slide, you'll see a total score. So in this example, we've scored 3 out of 6, or 50%, which isn't great, but it's definitely better than 0. And lastly, we tie this to the business impact. So at the bottom of each metric slide, we will showcase how does this relate to these business value, right? Do we think this is going to increase revenue? Do we think this reduces risk? Do we think this reduces costs or time to launch? So at this point in a smaller presentation, I would pause and say, are we all on the same page? Do we kind of understand the layout of all the subsequent slides we're about to look at? But since you can't ask me a question right now, I'm just going to nod my head and we're all going to move forward, assuming we're on the same page. So these are the 6 priority patient engagement metrics at BioMarin. We're going to track how well we're doing with regards to external education, our early engagement, our variety of inputs, or the often, if we want to go with the early and often mantra, co-creation of materials, trial closeout, and relationship management across the life cycle. So here I always like to pause and tell a sort of joke where whenever I talk to people about presenting on patient advocacy, all you really have to do if you want to act like you know something about patient engagement is just say early and often and repeat that mantra, because that's what everyone says all the time about patient engagement. Are you engaging early? Are you engaging often? And they're not wrong. Those buzzwords are worthy. And these 2 metrics, as you'll see, are probably weighted nearly the highest based on when I tie this to a financial dollar amount at the end. So without further ado, we're going to go slide by slide, 1 slide for each of these, and I'll show you the metrics we're using at BioMarin. So the first metric is about providing external education to the patient community by developing and executing on an external education plan. So in this example, how did we do external education well? Well, did you develop a plan? And then did you execute? Those are the 2 leading indicators to say if we did this well or not. The way we're tracking if we developed the plan well is the timing with which we developed the plan. So the first criteria is, did you develop a plan by your first patient in for your first treatment study? If so, great, 3 out of 3, 100%. By last patient in of your first treatment study, not so bad, 2 out of 3, or did you develop an external education program plan by the end of your program? 1 out of 3, at least you developed one. In this example, you see the plan is complete. We have a check mark. It was done at the design phase. So maybe it would have been better if we did it a little earlier at the research phase. So we scored 2 out of 3 because the strategic plan, which contains our external education plan, was developed between first patient in and last patient in of the first treatment study. So first off, did we develop a plan? Secondly, how did we execute upon it? And for this leading indicator, what we're really looking at is the different types of external education that your team has executed upon. And I give some examples here of types of things you might want to do to help guide the team. But in the comments, we really showcase what we've done. This is all also done in the design phase. And so we gave a presentation on the clinical development process at a patient conference, 1 point. We've sent out patient advocacy program updates. Looks like the last one happened in January. Great job, 1 more point. Gene therapy education has been developed with information about a specific therapeutic area. There's another point. And lastly, you'll see we've actually done 4 things on this example. So there was an educational resource that was posted on the corporate website, and it was shared in a patient group's newsletter. So these are all 4 great examples of how you could execute. You might be thinking, wow, there's 4 items here and we only scored 3. This is to showcase that you could go above and beyond do more external education, but there's no extra credit on these metrics. So you still score 3 out of 3 here with a total score of 5 out of 6 or 83% on external education, which is great. We hypothesize by achieving these activities, we will reduce time and reduce risk of a failed trial. So if the patient community is well educated, then maybe it reduces time because participants are more interested in enrolling in your trial. Or maybe it reduces risk because people are also less likely to speak negatively about your trial because they understand the mechanism of action or they understand the clinical development process. So this is metric number 1, external education. Metric number 2 is the early mantra. How early are we engaging? This one's very straightforward. There's one leading indicator. How early was your first input gathered? And we track this based on status of the protocols and enrollment. So was your earliest input gathered before the final draft protocol of your first study? So this could be a natural history, a non-intervention, a baseline observation study. It doesn't necessarily have to be treatment. You would score 5 out of 5. If you get input before the final draft of your first treatment study, 4 out of 5, which is the criteria we met in this example. Before first patient in of your first treatment study, 3 out of 5. Last patient in before your first treatment study, 2 out of 5. And if your early input was gathered before filing, great, at least you gathered input at some point, 1 out of 5. In this example, we met with the patient community for input on study design elements, and this occurred after the final protocol of the natural history study, but before finalization of our phase 1/2 protocol. A very realistic example, I think a lot of BioMarin's trials, we would probably engage before our first treatment study, but not always before our natural history study, 80% or 4 out of 5. We reduce risk. If you finalize a protocol before talking to the patient community about inclusion/exclusion criteria, about objectives, about the schedule of assessments, about burden and retention risks, then you're more likely to have to do a protocol amendment or potentially have a failed trial. So there's metric number 2, early. Let's jump into metric number 3, which is often. It's the early and often of the mantra, but really it's about getting input on a variety of aspects of your study design or your study elements. So the patient advocacy team at BioMarin agreed these are the 6 key aspects that regardless of program, regardless of therapeutic area, we should be getting input on these 6 items: inclusion/exclusion criteria, the endpoints for the trials, the assessments or the schedule of events in your protocols, the patient-reported outcomes and key clinical outcome measures, the burden and retention risks of your trials. So in this example, you'll see we've checked 5 of these 6 boxes. The status is green because it's on track, but it's not completed. This happened at the design phase, which is pretty good, and we'll probably end up checking the conduct phase when we get around to asking about PROs later. In this example, you see that we say initial input was gathered at a patient advisory board in this month of this year, where we were discussing the following elements, and I've listed the 5 items we discussed. So this is great. And when everyone talks about early and often, something I always want to chime in with is getting the input early, getting the input often isn't enough. You have to do something with the input. And that's why this second part of this metric, the second leading indicator, is I think the most important aspect of the entire metrics program. What did you do with the feedback? So for every item that's changed, removed, or added to your clinical program, you'll score 2 points. If an item is considered but not implemented and added to the risk register, it's a known risk that the team has said we're not changing this, 1 point. And if you don't provide the input to your team, then why did you gather the insights from the patient community in the first place? 0 points. You'll see this happen both at the conduct and design phases of the clinical trial. And luckily enough, in this example, we've done great. We scored 6 out of 6 because the inclusion/exclusion criteria was updated. Let's say it had to do with rate of asthma attacks, and someone said your participants need to have had 1 attack per week for the last year, and the patient community says nobody's tracking that. How are you going to put that in your protocol? So we changed it to a documented attack at least once a month. The second item here is an endpoint was identified as not the most important aspect to the patient community, but the team didn't change that. It was added to the risk register. So a good example would be the 6-minute walk test for a DMD trial, let's say. The patient community is saying, we don't think that's a proper assessment of the meaningful outcomes of a study drug, but the BioMarin team, let's say, says, well, we're going to stick with 6-minute walk test because the regulators already have accepted that as an acceptable endpoint. So we've noted in the risk register that way in 3 years, when someone comes back to us and says, why are we using 6-minute walk test? The patient community doesn't care about that. We can say, I know, I told you in 2021, we added it to the risk register. It was a known risk. The third example here is a scheduled event was changed. Let's say we reduced the number of assessments because burden was identified, 2 more points. However, we couldn't remove some of the assessments, so we added to the risk register, the trial is highly burdensome. And lastly, there's a retention issue. So we added home health visits to hopefully help with the long-term extension of a trial. There's 2 more points. So again, in this example, you'll see we've scored 8 out of 6, but it still equals 6 because based on the weighting we've estimated, we don't see value added or any more protocols basically not amended by making more changes. The business impact of getting input and taking action on that is threefold. You reduce risk, you reduce time, and you reduce costs by hopefully avoiding protocol amendments and improving patient satisfaction and potentially improving enrollment rates. We're halfway through the metrics, folks. Keep up the good work. I hope you're awake. Don't forget to submit questions to the team here through the Q&A feature if you have any questions. The 4th metric is about co-creation materials. There's a lot of percentages and numbers and acronyms here, so stick with me. These 2 leading indicators are actually one and the same aside from one word. Our team agreed that for any program, we should co-create at least 1 recruitment material and at least co-create 1 retention material. So all the criteria is exactly the same, except one's about a recruitment material and one's about a retention material. You'll see that these were both completed during the conduct and analysis phases, since maybe you do this while you're analyzing your phase 1-2 data, but you're conducting your phase 3 trial. So it meets that area between. And in these leading indicators relate to approvals in our ethics committees and institutional review boards. If you're not familiar with those 2 types of organizations, they are an independent group of folks. There's generally 1 for each clinical trial site. There are regionalized ones, but in general, you have an institutional review board or an ethics committee for every clinical trial site. And they say, is your study approvable? Are your recruitment materials ethical? Are your retention materials ethical? Is your protocol and the asks of your study safe? Is it ethical? So they look at this as general members of communities. Sometimes there's priests, school teachers, scientists, all kinds of people sit on these boards to just say, do we want this kind of trial existing in our community? And so the idea was to tie these approvals to these ethics committees, because if they're approved by the ethics committee, then hopefully the site is using them. And so if 75% of the ECs and IRBs approve, 3 out of 3, 25%, 2 out of 3, if you at least co-create the materials, but maybe they never get submitted or approved by ethics committees, 1 out of 3. And if you don't co-create materials, 0 out of 3. In this first example, these materials were co-created through partnership with a patient organization named Name, very creative name, Mike, and you score 1 point. These materials were also approved at 9 out of 10 sites, but this one site's ethics committee did not approve the material. That's still 2 more points because you scored 75%. So 2 + 1 is 3 out of 3. Excellent job. The second leading indicator here is about the retention materials. And in this example, the retention materials were co-created in a virtual advisory board setting with members of 5 different patient organizations. There's 1 point, and they're not yet submitted or approved at any ethics committees or IRBs. So you'll note that this is in progress, but hopefully we'll score 6 out of 6. It looks like we're on track. I should say these are all examples. I've made up this stuff before the presentation, but a lot of them are drawn from real examples of BioMarin programs for the metrics that do exist. By co-creating materials, you reduce risk and time in enrollment and potentially not having useless materials. Sometimes we'll develop materials, and when we show them to patient organizations we work with, someone says, this doesn't resonate, right? That's not a good way to explain gene therapy, or I don't like the word vector. It doesn't mean anything to me. So the idea is you reduce the risk of failed materials, and hopefully you reduce the time of enrolling your trials by having more effective materials to recruit and retain patients. The fifth metric is about closing out clinical trials by sharing results and acknowledging the contribution of patients and their caregivers. It goes without saying, right? We should always say thanks. Here's some data, really appreciate what you've done to the community, but it's actually not that easy to always do this successfully. So in this example, we haven't finished out any trials, so these are all not yet applicable. But in the first leading indicator, it's about sharing lay study summary results with the patient community. So if you share lay study summary results that are published and publicly available within 1 year of your last patient out, we're saying that's 3 out of 3, 100%. If you share it with national level patient organizations within 1 year of last patient out, 2 out of 3. And if you share it with any patient organization within 3 years of your last patient out, 1 out of 3. Great job. The reason that I've colored this in yellow, and this is part of my template, is BioMarin hasn't successfully developed or shared lay study summary results yet. So we're estimating this to be at risk. We have a few pilot programs ongoing. I would love to hear from any of you who are successfully doing this, where you post them, how you share them. Do people feel like this could be perceived as pre-approval promotion, or are you not broadly sharing this information, but just it exists, and if people find it, they find it? I'd love to hear what your compliance legal teams say about pushing out lay study summary results. The next leading indicator is about thanking your trial participants for their service to the community and to our company. And this is, again, what percentage of participants received your thank you notes. If 75+% received, then we'll give you 3 out of 3, 25+% received, 2 out of 3. And if at least one participant from any study that has ended, 1 out of 3. The idea is, did you even try and develop a thank you letter? Maybe it got shot down, but at least someone was thanked, you made the effort. To ensure success, we say that thank you notes should be submitted to ethics committees and IRBs at least 6 months prior to your first patient out. I think where we usually fumble with this is people think, oh, we'll do a thank you letter at the end of the trial. But you forget that your first patient in could have been done with the trial for 2 years before you're thinking about closing out the trial. So this needs to happen when you're submitting your recruitment materials, when you're submitting your first version of your protocol. It's not that hard to develop a thank you note and submit as soon as your trial's starting. The next item is an end of study and dropout survey. Again, it's what participants of your studies have taken this survey. And you'll notice this is in red in this example. And the reason I put it in red is on the last slide, we looked at recruitment and retention materials, which are on track, they've been submitted. However, this end of study survey isn't even part of, the end of study survey was not part of the protocol, and it hasn't even been submitted to ECs and IRBs yet. So this is probably at risk or not happening. So we're scoring X out of 8 because none of these are applicable yet. They won't count towards our total score, and I'll show you that on the last slide. The final metric we're tracking is about developing a transition plan and seamlessly transitioning relationships with patient advocacy groups to our commercial colleagues post-approval. The leading indicator we use to track this is, when did you develop your plan? 1 year prior to your first regulatory submission, 9 months prior to submission, or 6 months prior to submission. In the comments here, we have a guidance document is in development. Interestingly enough, when these metrics were developed, our team was only focused on the clinical development programs, but now BioMarin is taking a more centralized approach to patient advocacy. And we're not sure how many relationships will be transitioned versus staying with our organization. So this metric may not be relevant if we're looking at a holistic patient advocacy department. And we hypothesize that you could reduce risk and you could potentially increase revenue if you do have great relationships at the time of launch. So those are the 6 key metrics and how we're tracking them at BioMarin. This is actually slide 1 of the metrics, but I didn't want to put this slide up on the screen and have everybody's eyes glaze over right at the beginning. So what this really is it's a roll up of everything we just heard. 5 out of 6 on external education, 4 out of 5 on early, 11 out of 12 on often, 4 out of 6 in co-creation, and then X's on the last 2. I'm receiving a connection unstable message. Can you guys hear me okay still? If nobody jumps in, I will continue.
Yes, yes, we can.
Thank you. So the nice thing about this scorecard is maybe this first slide is all you show to management. And you say, look, through approval, we're tracking at about 60%, but that's fine. We haven't finalized any of our trials. And through our completed tasks, we're doing great. We're at 83%. And here's where we land. And if they wanted to hyperlink to specific slides, they could from this first slide. So maybe they care more about external education. They click here, it would link them to the external education slide. Now, this is actually all presented previously, and it's exciting, but it didn't tie directly to a dollar amount. And that's where I think we're lacking the interest of executives at most pharmaceutical companies. So now I'm going to take you into what is the actual revenue increase that we want to argue we've gained by doing patient engagement. So here's the reasoning behind my return on engagement calculation. If a program scores 20 out of 40, and I'll explain why 20 out of 40 matters, then we believe patient engagement efforts have at a minimum met one of these 2 conditions. We've either avoided a protocol amendment, or we've improved patient satisfaction enough to reduce enrollment times and/or dropout rates. So what's the impact of those things? Well, it's a reduction of time and an increase in revenue. The reduction of time would be, on average for a protocol amendment, is about 90 days or 3 months. And we're going to argue that if you've met these criteria, you've also reduced enrollment by 90 days. And we're saying you've reduced enrollment from your first trial's FPI to your last trial's LPI. So really 3 months over the course of a 7 to 10 year program isn't an absurd thing to say we've helped reduce that impact on. So the revenue increase, the dollar amount, how we got to this dollar amount, is we're going to say you get to launch 3 months faster. So you receive 1/4 of your first year's projected sales earlier. And when you throw that dollar amount up to executives when you're asking for budget, it all of a sudden becomes a lot easier to ask for the $100,000 to run an advisory board. So we believe a score 20 out of 40 is relevant because early and often, let's get back to early and often. If you do early engagement perfect and the often or variety of aspects perfect, then you score 17. So therefore, I'm arguing if you do early and often perfect, you score 17. Then if you just do one other thing well, you hit that 20 threshold. Plus 20 out of 40, half of the things sounds good, it's clean, it's crisp. So if you think about it, if you do early and often plus external education or co-creation of materials or thanking the community or transitioning the community, transitioning your relationships, then you've hit that 20 out of 40. So here's the dollars. These are the same criteria up top, but the impact of protocol amendments is calculated as 90 days delay or $141,000 increased cost. This is from an article by Getz and the impact of protocol amendments. This actually looked at about 800 protocols. And so the average across those, I think for a phase 2 study, was $141,000 in increased cost. So we're calculating that by meeting this 20 out of 40, you would have a return on engagement of $141,000 plus the 25% of your first year sales. So if your first year sales for this BMN XXX product was $10 million, then we're going to argue the return on engagement is $2.6 million. So congratulations, you've just saved $2.5 million, or you've increased the revenue of $2.5 million earlier by doing patient engagement very effectively. So what's next? With metrics, what's next is I'm going to present this as my capstone project at a PPALS webinar today. It's happening right now. Congratulations. We can check this off the list. And here is a plug. If you haven't attended PPALS, you should. If you haven't and you haven't completed your capstone project yet, it's worth it. We're going to build the knowledge of patient advocacy in the life sciences by doing these kinds of projects. So I encourage everybody to attend or dust off that project and start working on it again. It did take me a couple of years to do it. So there it is. That's my plug, Barb. I encourage folks to leverage these metrics in their programs, which is in progress as of 30 seconds ago. Please leverage these and give us feedback. We're going to write a white paper on the metrics program. I'm working with Rob at PPALS. I hope to do this quarter, and then we'll submit for publication to peer-reviewed journals in the second quarter. And lastly, and ongoing, we're going to be asking for feedback on the metrics, the leading indicator scoring system, and then also any commercial metrics to expand this program beyond just research and development. That's all I wanted to touch on the metrics, but I do want to leave you with some closing thoughts and some background on BioMarin and how we're doing advocacy and where I think we need to get to as an organization, or as the industry as a whole as it relates to patient advocacy. So at BioMarin, patient advocacy is members of the following teams: the clinical development team, or our entire program team, all the studies for an individual drug product; the study execution team, single study; the data evidence and integration team. This is a neat team at BioMarin that says, what are the data gaps we'd like to fill and how best to fill them? So if the idea is we need more information on unmet need, the data evidence team identifies, hey, we need more information on unmet need. Patient advocacy, could you get patient input on this? Market access, medical affairs, could you please get input from HCPs and the general public on this, and payers? And then lastly is the patient advocacy and partnerships team. This is a cross-functional team at BioMarin that says, here's the 11 different functions that all want patient input, that want patient insights. How do we come out of this team aligned as a single BioMarin to say, here's our ask of the patient community and how can we support you in meeting your objectives? The only reason I give these teams and structures right now is to leave you with this. Advocacy needs to be involved as soon as a company is thinking about getting into a therapeutic area, right? And these metrics are a great way to work towards getting a seat at the table. Why, business development discussions. If we're going to acquire a product, patient advocacy should actually say, yes, there's need. Moving a product out of early portfolio into the clinic, again, patient advocacy should be involved in these kinds of discussions. Companies have chief medical officers, chief scientific officers, but a lot of them, including the one I work for, lacks chief patient officers. And I think if we can demonstrate the value of patient engagement with a dollar amount, we'll soon have a seat at these tables. And so we're seeing these metrics as a first step in the right direction to really showcasing the value of patient advocacy in the pharma industry. So with that, I leave you with an audience challenge. I challenge everybody here to establish a patient engagement metrics program for your company, and feel free to leverage this template if you find that to be useful. You can contact me directly. I'd love to discuss any of these number of things, from how would you integrate these metrics and ideas at your program and study teams, to where does advocacy sit at your organization? Or how do you, or would you capture patient engagement activities and metrics for your preclinical and commercial programs? Because that's a gap I have now that our team's covering more than just clinical development is, how do we track if our efforts are going well in the commercialized products? Or how do we know if we're getting the right insights for our early portfolio? And then lastly, let's have a webinar and determine what we've learned. I think something that would be amazing is if this metrics is published in a peer-reviewed article, and the next thing we could do is a case study. 20 pharmaceutical organizations across the globe are using this metrics program. What have we learned? What is the actual ROI? How have we adjusted the scoring based upon this? And with that, I'll turn it over to Barb for Q&A. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being here, and thanks a lot to PPALS for having me as well. It's been a blast.
Mike, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for putting all the effort into doing it for us. I think you've caused us all to think down another path and how we approach what we do, and kind of taken us to a higher level of functioning, if you will, and that we now have a way to put dollars and cents to what we do, which I think is very convincing when you're trying to sell an executive team on why you need a big budget for patient advocacy. So we have several questions that have come in during the course of the discussion, And I know several of you raised your hands, but we did not have that function enabled. So let me take it away with some questions. All right, here we go. 1 second till I pull them down. There's a comment here from Aaron Slattery, who has a consulting firm, saying that they've developed lay summaries for clients who have shared them with patient communities without concern being noted about it being promotional. So there's an answer to that question.
I appreciate that. And we're developing them now, so I assume we will have similar insights. But if anybody's hit any roadblocks too, and let me know how you've overcome them.
Okay, next question. Is the end of the study survey considered the same as an exit interview? If not, what's the difference?
That's a great question. We haven't directly clarified what must be in the end of study survey. The way I see it, though, is a way to assess, did the trial meet your needs? Did we explain things clearly to you? Did it meet your expectations, right? So, and I see this as a way to reduce risk in either future patients at that same site or the same study, or in future trials. So if all the participants at a single site said, I had no idea when my next visit was, then it might be useful to be able to pivot and say, here's a tool that helps you schedule your trial visit. So it's just a good way to get insights. We haven't clarified what should go in the end of study survey, but it could be like an exit interview. And ideally, we would have a pre-meeting survey, a mid-meeting or pre-study survey, a mid-study survey, and an end study survey. But we haven't actually developed a template of what that must look like.
But a good idea to do so, huh? Next question. Do you pay honorees? Do you work from an enterprise approach or an R&D program, or by R&D programs? And how does this framework apply to failed programs in communication?
So those are all great questions. We do pay honoraria, and it's based on a fair market value tool, which we work with compliance on a case by case, ask by ask, and country by country approach. However, there's definitely areas to improve, especially as organizations become more global. So for example, I'm working with a global organization. There's an attendee from France, there's an attendee from the US, there's an attendee from the UK. I would like to argue, why don't we pay them all one flat rate versus using the fair market value tool that's agreed upon? But that's something we'll need to work through. So yes, we pay honoraria. Secondly, an enterprise approach or by R&D program. It's a combination of both. So we have enterprise-wide approaches to patient engagement. For example, we have a Global Patient Advocacy Leadership Council, which gets together VP level leaders across the organization to say, what does patient centricity mean at BioMarin? Should we have a patient advisory board that helps us with external communications, like what goes on our corporate website, things across the entire enterprise? Or should we collaborate across companies on education initiatives? If a patient organization says, I want you to work with 5 companies to develop gene therapy education, does BioMarin do that? So that's some enterprise aspects. But also, we don't always do by R&D program because, for example, in our PKU franchise, there's 3 programs, but 1 therapeutic area. So we tend to do our approaches by therapeutic area, not necessarily by a single R&D program. And the last part of that question was, how does this framework apply to failed programs and communication? So we're trying to develop a standard for what do we do if a product is sold? What do we do if a product is failed? We don't have a systematic agreed upon what do we do with this. However, for things like our patient advocacy forums, which are cross-therapeutic area meetings that we have every year in different regions, we still do include the organizations from failed or sold programs to be welcome to come and participate in these meetings with us as well.
Thanks, Mike. Have you measured the impact of caregiver support during the trial, meaning psych, social, emotional support, or is that outside the current scorecard?
So that was in the original metrics, and we classified it as what's the word that I can't remember that I removed? Remove the,
Tangible?
is that what it's called? Intangible?
Tangible. Mhm.
Yeah, it sounded so wrong to me. It is intangible. Remove the intangibles. So we think it's very valuable to measure psychosocial support and those kinds of things, but we don't know how to quantify it. And we don't know if that would be valuable to senior executives to hear about it. So we've removed it from the metrics, but it is something we still strive to do. And I don't think, I might have glossed over the part of me wanting to say this, is that this should not be the only things you do in advocacy. These are the things you should showcase up to people you're asking money for. But please don't forget to build strong relationships, to do things that improve patient satisfaction that can't necessarily track to a financial value. And don't forget to do things like patient community mapping. It's important to know how the community feels, what their capabilities are. But we don't put it in the metrics program because we can't necessarily say this is going to reduce cost of your clinical trial by doing it.
Okay. How do you respond to pressure to demonstrate evidence? The input you received most definitely led to avoidance of a protocol amendment.
So that's the billion-dollar question. And I had a conversation with one of the authors of the Bennett Levitan article to say, look, I feel like I'm making leaps and bounds to say we've definitely avoided a protocol amendment, because sometimes you just are going to have an amendment regardless of the insights you get. So anyone who has ideas on how to provide concrete evidence of this, please do. It's difficult, and there isn't there. So currently we haven't received any pressure to say, well, you didn't stop a protocol amendment, because I'm not actually saying we've increased the budget by, increase our budget by $2.5 million because of this. But it's a good way to come to the table to showcase value. So I guess it's a long way of skipping around the question to say I don't have an answer for that yet, but please help me answer it.
Okay. What's been the internal response to this metric at BioMarin? Have they been supportive, challenging?
So, oh, sorry, I'm not following the question. Is it like I didn't find the question?
That's okay. I just asked it.
Okay. So nobody's pushed back against these metrics. They've only been presented to the study teams, the clinical development teams, and to an all hands meeting of the operations team, the folks actually running the development sciences operations aspects. So that's a next big step for me and the head of my department, is to decide, how do we share this information upwards, and what's the value in that? And also, is there a concern that there will be pushback? So they've so far been received positively, but I think it's like with many things, sure, that's patient advocacy, that sounds good, right? So we need to push harder to really showcase, here's the value, here's how much money you could earn by doing this well.
Well, and also probably after you have 2 or 3 trials go by without any protocol amendments, that will make them sit up and take notice, I would think.
And just by doing these efforts, so 3 years ago when I joined the team, it was, how do we get people to want to care about what the community says? Now we have to start telling people, look, we can't have an advisory board about everything. We can't ask the patients about everything because we don't have time and money to do that. So people are coming to advocacy and saying, we want input on this protocol. We want input on this. So that aspect of the culture has been shifting just in people see the value of the insights. So that's definitely shifted in the last 3 years.
Good. The patient commitment to participate in gene therapy programs is far longer than in small molecule or ERT. How does your model balance that issue, and what return to financial impact or savings for engagement do you have as a minimum threshold for savings to get the executive team's attention?
Okay, can you help me find that question so I can read along with it?
It's under Michael Bodulow.
Oh, good name.
Yeah, we know that guy.
Perfect. So the patient commitments for participation in gene therapy programs is far longer than a small molecule or biologic or an ERT. How does the model balance that issue? And with regards to financial impacts and savings for engagement, do you see a minimum thresholds of savings that gets attention from executives? So at this point, we haven't seen a threshold for what gets attention from executives. However, in the example I showed, I said you're going to make $10 million in your first year projected sales. I don't think anybody's actually projecting that low of first year sales as a pharma company. So when that number becomes $100 million for your first year sales, and you're saying you're saving them 25 million, or you're earning them 25 million faster, I think it will really catch their eye when you increase these dollar amounts on your projections. The metrics don't currently balance retention issues based on a 5-year follow-up for a long-term gene therapy versus a 1-year clinical trial for something like an ERT or a small molecule. So the model is really looking at the minimum. And so we say at a minimum, you're going to reduce, the only thing we're saying is we're going to reduce enrollment by 3 months or dropouts enough to save you 3 months worth of enrollment time, or remove one amendment in the entire program. And that's where we're arguing this savings comes from. So I think there's definitely areas for improving this and balancing the concepts of how long's a trial, how long's a program, but we're not there yet.
Thanks, Mike. Can you tell me if the term patient engagement is comprehensive of patient recruitment, retention, and patient advocacy? Have you had good relations with your clinical operations counterparts?
So our team does have very good relations with our clinical operations counterparts. So our team is called Global Patient Advocacy and Engagement because we wanted to try and encompass all the ideas. We see advocacy oftentimes as working with advocacy organizations, also advocating for what's best for the patient community at our company, and also access to treatments, all those kinds of things. And then we've added engagement in there because I see engagement as attending conferences, having phone calls, meeting with groups. So we try and encompass everything in what we talk about. And we try to say patient advocacy and engagement to try and catch all of that. And we also try to say the patient community instead of patient organizations or patient groups or patients or caregivers, because it's patients, it's caregivers, it's patient advocates. The idea is we want to encompass everyone when we speak about these things. And there's so much nomenclature that we do want to roll out a lexicon that talks about these terms. I hope that answers the question.
I think it did. How do you reflect a missed metric when something is completely out of your control? For example, the trial is discontinued, key internal stakeholders left with all of the intel, worldwide pandemic. Do you accept a 0? And also, what internal agreements do you obtain before rolling this out? There is so much interdependency.
Yeah, great question. So we definitely accept a 0 if it's missed or failed, whether it's up to our control or not. The idea, a lot of our earliest programs that this metrics occurs for, we're scoring like 30, 40% because we didn't even have a patient advocacy team who was dedicated to this condition until phase 3. And so a lot of this is to showcase, look how low we're scoring, and look at how many amendments we're having, look at how the delays we had. And then if you look at a brand new program that's just starting, we get patient input before the natural history trial, we're engaging early, we're engaging often, we're hitting all these things. The idea is now here we're scoring 60, 70%. Are we seeing an impact in that? So definitely you can score a 0. So honestly, if an entire program has failed, I doubt people are really going to want to ask. Well, that's a good question. I was going to say, I doubt people are going to want to see the metrics, but in actuality, they'll probably really want to see the metrics to see, could we have done something different? So we will track it as it is, and we don't really speculate this was not at the fault of patient advocacy or it was, because this isn't only efforts our team's making. It involves the entire company. We haven't really asked for permission to roll this out or gotten agreement with executives or other functions to say, should we track this? We've started saying to people, this is what we're doing. We're going to track it to showcase. And we've stopped asking for permission, right? That's another thing we need to kind of do, is to infiltrate the organization. We need to come in as the voice of the patient. We need to stop saying, can we do an ad board? Can we measure? And just tell people we're doing this. And we need to make sure we're not the rate limiters. So you need to get the timeline of the protocol finalization. And you can't just say, oh, we're going to do an ad board in April when the protocol is finalized in January. You can't be the delaying factor. Patient advocacy needs to be ahead of the ball and built into the processes to not delay the program, which is the hardest thing because the pharma industry moves so quickly. Especially, that's something BioMarin really prides themselves on, is how fast we run our trials, how quickly we can get a therapy to those without it. So it's really up to our team to be immensely proactive and get insights before we think they need them, because it's not unusual to hear, yeah, protocol will be done in April, and then come February, they're saying we're finalizing the protocol. So we need to have those insights before we need them.
Okay. What intangibles, what would you like to add to the intangibles list if you could design it?
So, well, actually, I would like to add nothing to the intangibles list for metrics, because my goal with this metrics program is to showcase a return on investment, a return on engagement, something that makes executives say, take all of our money, patient advocacy, because you're going to save us $25 million next year or over the next however many years. So I don't want to add intangibles to the metrics program, but I would love to be able to develop a list of all the intangibles that an advocacy department should do, right? We should build meaningful relationships with the patient community that not only balances BioMarin's business objectives, but it also balances the needs of the patient community. It's so easy for a pharma company to say, we got everything we needed from the patient community without aligning on the objectives of the patient community. Maybe that community wants connections for adolescents with the condition. How can we help them with those connections they want to make? Or trying to make up another example here. So how do we measure patient satisfaction or the relationships we hold, right? Are we building meaningful relationships with the community? That's something I'd like to know, but I don't know how we could track it. And I don't think it belongs in this metrics program, but I think it is something we should strive to do. Other examples, those are two examples I can think of right now.
A clarification question, Mike. For how many people work in patient advocacy at BioMarin? And are you considered in patient advocacy, or are you considered part of the clinical operations organization?
So when these metrics were developed, we were part of development science operations. So the head of ClinOps and the head of dev side patient advocacy reported up to the same person. So we were part of ClinOps in essence. Now BioMarin is our global patient advocacy and engagement at BioMarin is outside of R&D, it's outside of commercial, it's outside of technical operations and manufacturing. And we span the entire life cycle. However, the question of how many people at BioMarin work in patient engagement is a funny one, because global patient advocacy and engagement has about 10 plus people, but there's also still a regulatory engagement team. There's commercial patient advocacy people. There's people in research who want to discuss with the patient community. There are people in market access. So that's why we have that patient advocacy and partnerships team, plus all of the clinical team members who want this, to coordinate these approaches. And so I would say there's upwards of 50 people who either want to do patient advocacy or need insights from patient advocacy. And that's why they have to come to this team to discuss.
Okay. So I think it, it can go a lot of different ways in every company. So that concludes our presentation today. Thank you so much for joining us. Our next webinar will be in April. We'll get the date out to you in the next couple of weeks. It's actually going to be a two-part series, case profiles on the journey into patient advocacy. And then the second part will be building blocks of patient advocacy hiring. Now, Mike put out a challenge to all of you to share with him examples of how you're integrating these tools in your own companies. And when we get 3 or 4 good examples together, we will have at least a Zoom call to gather everybody that's interested to talk about it. Again, thank you to Mike for a great presentation. And thank you to Brannigan Communications in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who did all the behind the scenes work for us to make this webinar possible. If you would like to learn more about professional patient advocacy in the life sciences or to join our organization, please go to our ppals.org website. It's all the information is there. Again, it was great to have all of you with us. I hope it was a beneficial experience for you, and we look forward to chatting with you again at our next webinar. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.